On a crisp spring morning in New Hampshire, with mist hanging over the ancient pines of the White Mountains, State Trooper Thomas Owens set out for a routine patrol. What began as an ordinary day soon turned into something far more unexpected when he encountered a mother Canada lynx trying to cross Route 302 with her cubs. When the mother abandoned her weakest kitten by the roadside, Owens was faced with a difficult choice: intervene or let nature take its course. His decision not only altered the fate of two vulnerable lynx kittens, but also rekindled a sense of purpose he'd long buried within himself. But this was just the beginning. What Thomas discovered in those woods the following day would set off a series of events that no one could have foreseen. Before we dive in, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you never miss a new story. The morning had arrived crisp and clear over the White Mountains of New Hampshire, the kind of spring day that made Thomas Owens grateful for his job as a state trooper. There was something about patrolling these winding roads, surrounded by ancient forests and breathtaking vistas, that brought him peace. At 52, with salt and pepper hair and laugh lines etched around his eyes, Trooper Owens had seen just about everything in his 30 years of service. Or so he thought. The radio crackled to life, breaking the comfortable silence in his cruiser. Dispatch to 243. We've got reports of a wildlife situation on Route 302 near the Mount Washington Hotel. Some kind of wildcat trying to cross with young. Several near misses reported. Can you check it out? Thomas adjusted his hat and reached for the radio. This is 243. I'm about 5 minutes out, on my way. As a lifelong resident of Carroll, New Hampshire, Thomas knew the area's wildlife better than most. Canada lynxes were elusive creatures, rarely seen by humans, let alone causing traffic disruptions. Something unusual was happening. His thoughts briefly wandered to his late wife Margaret. She had passed 3 years ago, but her love for animals had remained a constant presence in his life. Every creature has a story, she used to say. We just need to be quiet enough to hear it. The stately white facade of the Mount Washington Hotel came into view, and just beyond it, Thomas saw the commotion. Several cars had pulled to the shoulder, and a small crowd had gathered, pointing toward the tree line. Thomas parked his cruiser, flipped on the emergency lights, and stepped out. Folks, please get back in your vehicles, he called as he approached the scene. What's going on here? A middle-aged woman in hiking gear stepped forward. Officer, there's a Canada lynx with kittens trying to cross. She's been at it for almost 20 minutes. One of the little ones seems to be struggling. Thomas followed her gesture and spotted the animals. The mother Canada lynx stood at the edge of the forest, her tawny coat dappled with shadows, ears erect and alert. Behind her, 4 tiny kittens huddled together, their spotted fur blending with the forest floor. The scene might have been heartwarming, if not for the obvious distress of the mother and the concerning weakness of one of the kittens. I need everyone to clear the area, Thomas announced, his voice firm but kind. Give them space. I'll handle traffic control. As the onlookers reluctantly dispersed, Thomas radioed for backup to help manage the road. He positioned his cruiser to block one lane and stood ready to stop traffic from the other direction when necessary. For the next half hour, Thomas observed the mother Canada lynx's determined efforts. She would pick up one kitten by the scruff of its neck, carry it across the road, deposit it in the underbrush on the other side, then return for the next. The first 3 crossings went smoothly, but when she attempted to move the 4th kitten, noticeably smaller than its siblings, the little one struggled in her grasp. Twice, the mother had to set the kitten down mid-crossing when it squirmed too much. Thomas felt his heart tighten as he watched the mother's increasingly frantic movements. Her golden eyes darted between the struggling kitten and her other 3 offspring already waiting across the road. Come on, little one, Thomas murmured under his breath. You can do it. But on the 3rd attempt, the kitten barely moved when its mother nudged it with her nose. Even from a distance, Thomas could see the kitten was breathing rapidly, its tiny sides heaving with the effort. What happened next would haunt Thomas for days. After several more attempts to rouse the weakening kitten, the mother Canada lynx made a sound, something between a growl and a cry, before turning and trotting across the road to where her other 3 kittens waited. She paused, looking back at the abandoned kitten, before leading her remaining offspring deeper into the forest. Well, I'll be damned, Thomas whispered, removing his hat. He had heard of wildlife abandoning the weakest of their young when survival was at stake, but witnessing it firsthand was different. The abandoned kitten lay still by the roadside, occasionally moving its head but clearly too weak to follow. Thomas knew the protocol. Nature should take its course. Wild animals weren't pets, and intervention often did more harm than good. But as he watched the tiny creature struggle, Margaret's voice echoed in his mind. Every creature deserves a chance, Tom. Even the smallest ones. Especially the smallest ones. Before he could talk himself out of it, Thomas radioed dispatch. This is 243. I've got an abandoned Canada Lynx kitten here. Appears to be in distress. I'm going to need contact information for Fish and Game and possibly a wildlife rehabilitator. Copy that. 243. I'll make those calls. Stand by while we wait for further instructions. Thomas approached the kitten cautiously. It couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, its eyes open, but glazed. Its spotted coat appeared dull. Removing his jacket, Thomas carefully scooped up the tiny animal, which offered no resistance, a worrying sign. "Hang in there, little guy," he murmured, cradling the bundle against his chest. The kitten was lighter than he expected, barely the weight of a softball. When his radio crackled again, the dispatcher informed him that a Fish and Game officer was en route and had contacted a licensed wildlife rehabilitator. They say to keep the animal warm and minimize handling. They also say this is the right call. Relief washed over him. Within 15 minutes, Jane Martinez from New Hampshire Fish and Game arrived. Her department truck pulled up behind Thomas's cruiser. Well, she said, approaching with a small animal carrier. When dispatch said Trooper Owens had a Canada Lynx situation, I figured it had to be something unusual. You've got quite the reputation for wildlife encounters. Thomas managed a smile. He and Jane had worked together before, most recently when a moose wandered into the town center last fall. This one's different, Jane continued. The mother abandoned it. She couldn't bear to leave it. Jane peered at the bundle in Thomas's jacket. Female. Probably 3 or 4 weeks old. Significantly underweight. She gently transferred the kitten to the carrier. Good thing you called, she said. She wouldn't have made it out here alone. Will she survive? Thomas asked the question, his voice thick with emotion. Jane's expression softened. Hard to say. Linda at the rehab center works miracles, but this little one's pretty weak. I'll take her straight there. Thomas nodded, suddenly aware of how invested he'd become in the tiny creature's fate. Keep me posted. You got it, Trooper. As Jane drove away with the precious cargo, Thomas remained standing by the roadside for a long moment, staring into the forest where the mother Canada Lynx had disappeared with her other kittens. Something about the day's events stirred emotions he had carefully buried since Margaret's passing. The remainder of his shift passed in a blur. By evening, when Thomas finally pulled into the driveway of his modest lakeside home, exhaustion weighed heavily on his shoulders. Inside, the house was quiet, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock that had belonged to Margaret's father. Thomas fed his aging golden retriever, Solomon, and collapsed into his favorite armchair, still in uniform. He must have dozed off, because the ringing of his phone startled him awake. It was Jane. Thomas, the kitten stabilized for now. Linda's got her on fluids, and she's responding well. Thought you'd want to know. That's great news, Thomas replied, relief evident in his voice. Thanks for calling. There's something else, Jane continued, her tone changing slightly. Linda found something unusual during her examination. This kitten has traces of a particular antibiotic in her system, one that's sometimes used to treat wildlife in managed studies. There's a research team from UNH that's been tracking a female Canada Lynx in that area for the past year. Thomas sat up straighter. You think this is their Canada Lynx? It's possible. They've been monitoring her since before she would have conceived these kittens. Linda's reaching out to them now. If it is their research subject, they might have additional information that could help with rehabilitation. After hanging up, Thomas found himself unable to return to sleep. Instead, he brewed a pot of coffee and sat on his back porch, gazing out at the moonlit lake. Solomon settled at his feet with a contented sigh. What do you think, old boy? Thomas murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Did I do the right thing today?" Solomon looked up at him with soulful eyes, as if to say, "Of course you did." The next morning dawned with a sense of purpose that Thomas hadn't felt in years. His day off stretched before him, and he knew exactly how he wanted to spend it. After a quick breakfast, he drove to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, where Linda Parker had been caring for the Canada Lynx kitten. The center, situated on 20 acres of woodland outside Conway, consisted of a main building flanked by various enclosures and outbuildings. Thomas had visited before, usually dropping off injured animals found during his patrols, but had never stayed long. Linda met him at the entrance, her silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her hands encased in latex gloves. "Thomas, Jane said you might stop by. Come on back." She led him through the main treatment area, where various wildlife, a barred owl with an injured wing, a porcupine recovering from an encounter with a car, and 2 orphaned raccoons being tended to by volunteers, were being cared for. "How's our little friend doing?" Thomas asked, following Linda into a quieter back room. Linda's face broke into a smile. "Much better than expected. She's a fighter." She gestured to a small incubator, where the Canada Lynx kitten lay on a heated pad, and 4 line delivering fluids. The kitten looked marginally better than the day before, her eyes more alert, though she remained worryingly still. "Has she eaten anything?" Thomas asked. "A little bit of special formula. Not enough, but it's progress." Linda checked the 4 and adjusted the temperature settings. The research team called this morning. This is indeed one of their study subjects' offspring. They've been tracking the mother for 18 months. Thomas moved closer to the incubator, mesmerized by the tiny wild cat. "Do they know anything that might help?" he asked. Linda nodded. They've observed her several times over the past month. According to their field notes, she had 5 kittens initially, which is extremely unusual for Canada lynxes. Normally, they have 2 or 3. 5 would put enormous strain on her ability to nurse them all adequately. 5. Thomas repeated, brow furrowing. "I only saw 4 yesterday, the 3 she took with her and this little one." A troubled expression crossed Linda's face. "That's what concerns me. If there was a 5th kitten." Thomas didn't need her to finish the thought. Somewhere out there could be another abandoned kitten, even weaker than this one. "I'm going back," he said decisively. "If there's another one out there, we need to find it." Linda placed a hand on his arm. "Thomas, the chances of finding another kitten after all this time, and even if you do, I have to try," he said simply. After getting directions to the research team's last known sighting locations, Thomas drove back to Breton Woods. The day had turned overcast, a light drizzle making the forest glisten. He parked in the same spot as the day before and stood for a moment, studying the surrounding woods. If he were a mother Canada lynx with hungry kittens, where would he den? Somewhere sheltered, near water, with good visibility of approaching predators. Thomas set off into the forest, following a faint game trail that paralleled the road for about a quarter mile before curving deeper into the trees. For 2 hours, Thomas searched methodically, drawing on all his outdoors experience. The rain intensified, soaking through his jacket, but he pressed on. Just as he was considering turning back, a sound caught his attention. So faint, he almost missed it over the patter of rain. Following the noise, Thomas pushed through a dense thicket and found himself in a small clearing. There, beside a fallen log, lay a tiny Canada lynx kitten, even smaller than the one he'd rescued yesterday. It mewled weakly, its fur sodden from the rain, eyes barely open. "I'll be damned," Thomas whispered, heart pounding. "You're a survivor, aren't you?" Linda quickly transferred the kitten into her care and rushed it inside, Thomas following closely behind. What followed was a flurry of activity: warming the hypothermic kitten, administering fluids, and checking its vital signs. Thomas stood back, acutely aware of how out of his depth he was, but unwilling to leave. After what seemed like an eternity, Linda stepped back from the treatment table, peeling off her gloves. "She's stabilized," Linda announced, her expression serious but not defeated. "It's touch and go, but she has a chance. You found her just in time." The relief that washed over Thomas was so profound that he had to sit down, suddenly aware of his own soaked state and the exhaustion from the day's search. Linda tossed him a towel and a spare sweatshirt from a nearby closet. "Get yourself dried off before you catch pneumonia. Coffee's in the break room." Somewhat restored, with dry clothes and a hot cup of coffee in hand, Thomas found himself drawn back to the room where both Canada Lynx kittens now rested in adjacent incubators. The first kitten, whom Linda had begun calling Hope, looked markedly better than she had that morning. The second kitten, now named Faith, remained critical but had shown small signs of improvement. "Two little miracles," Linda said, joining him. Thomas nodded, watching the rise and fall of their tiny chests. "What happens to them now?" "We'll raise them here until they're strong enough for a soft release, probably this fall. They'll need to learn hunting skills, avoid humans, all the things their mother would have taught them." She glanced at Thomas. "It's a long road ahead." "I'd like to help," Thomas said, surprising himself with the offer. "Whatever you need." Linda studied him thoughtfully. "You know, we could use another volunteer for weekend feedings. The hours are terrible, and the pay is non-existent." Thomas chuckled. "Sounds perfect." And so began a new chapter in Thomas Owens's life. Twice a week, he would stop by the rehabilitation center before or after his shifts. Initially, his visits were focused entirely on the Canada Lynx kittens, watching their remarkable progress with a sense of investment he hadn't felt in years. Hope and Faith graduated from incubators to a small indoor enclosure, then to a larger outdoor space designed to introduce them to their natural environment while keeping them safe. As the weeks passed, Thomas's involvement expanded. He found himself helping with other animals, repairing enclosures, and even assisting with educational programs for local schools. The volunteers, mostly retirees and college students, welcomed him warmly, and Thomas discovered a community he hadn't realized he was missing. One evening in late July, Thomas arrived at the center to find Linda bubbling with excitement. "The research team spotted the mother Canada Lynx and her 3 kittens this morning," she announced. "All healthy and thriving. They're denning about 3 miles from where you found Faith." Thomas felt a rush of satisfaction. "That's great news." "So she made the right call, difficult as it was." Linda nodded. "In the wild, difficult decisions are made for survival. She couldn't save all 5, but thanks to her and you, all 5 will have a chance at life." By September, Hope and Faith had transformed from fragile creatures into sleek, energetic young Canada Lynxes with distinct personalities. Hope was bold and curious, often the first to investigate new objects in their enclosure. Faith remained more cautious but displayed remarkable climbing abilities, often perching on the highest branches to survey her domain. As their release date approached, Thomas felt a surprising mixture of pride and melancholy. He had known from the beginning that the goal was always to return them to the wild, but the prospect of saying goodbye was unexpectedly difficult. The day of the release dawned clear and cool, the mountains ablaze with autumn colors. The location had been carefully chosen, a secluded valley within the Canada Lynx's natural range, but far enough from the mother's territory to avoid conflict. The release would be soft. A temporary enclosure had been built on site, allowing the young Canada Lynxes to acclimate to their new surroundings before the doors were opened, and they could leave at their own pace. Thomas helped transport the crates containing Hope and Faith to the site, maintaining a professional demeanor despite the emotion welling in his chest. Sensing his mood, Linda squeezed his shoulder. "This is the hardest part of the job," she said softly, "but also the most rewarding." The release itself was anticlimactic. The crates containing Hope and Faith were carefully placed inside the temporary enclosure, the metal doors opened, and the humans retreated to a respectful distance, watching through binoculars. Hope was the first to emerge, as expected. She hesitated at the entrance for a moment, her bright eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. Cautiously, she explored the enclosure, sniffing the ground and rubbing her face against the new scents. Then, with a graceful leap, she climbed a small tree, sitting atop its branches as she surveyed her new environment. Faith followed more slowly, still hesitant and unsure. She stayed close to the familiar crate, almost as if it were a lifeline in this vast new world. For a while, she simply watched Hope from a distance, but soon curiosity overtook her. She padded carefully across the enclosure, pausing to investigate the tree that Hope had climbed. She gingerly touched the bark with her paws, her cautious nature evident in every movement. Yet, as time passed, the two kittens began to show more confidence. They explored every corner of the enclosure, testing their boundaries and learning to trust the space that would soon become their new home. For an hour, Thomas watched intently through binoculars as the two young lynxes began to engage with their new surroundings. They moved through the space with increasing confidence, their movements growing more sure and fluid. The volunteers had carefully planned this soft release to give Hope and Faith the opportunity to adapt to the wild at their own pace. They would remain in the temporary enclosure for 2 weeks, with food provided by the volunteers that would gradually decrease. The idea was to allow them to gradually transition to hunting for themselves and, eventually, to live independently. After the 2 weeks, the door to the enclosure would be opened, allowing the kittens to leave when they were ready, but still with a safe place to return to if needed. As the team began to pack up, Linda approached Thomas and handed him a small gift bag. He looked at her, a bit puzzled, as she smiled knowingly. "A little something to remember them by," Linda said with a soft chuckle. Inside the bag, Thomas found a framed photograph of himself sitting between the two incubators on that first day, the day Hope and Faith had been brought in. His expression was a mixture of concern and hope, the weight of uncertainty heavy in his eyes. Beneath the photo was a simple, yet profound inscription: "Every creature deserves a chance." Thomas swallowed hard, feeling the lump in his throat. He had forgotten how much Margaret used to say that. She had always spoken of second chances with such conviction. Linda smiled warmly. Great minds think alike. In the months that followed, Thomas continued his volunteer work at the rehabilitation center while still maintaining his duties as a state trooper. His commitment to the center was unwavering. On his days off, he would stop by, often helping with other animals in need, repairing enclosures, and even assisting with educational programs for local schools. Occasionally, the research team would send updates about Hope and Faith, and the news was always positive. The two lynxes had successfully adapted to life in the wild. Trail cameras had captured images of them hunting together, exploring their surroundings, and even interacting briefly with other Canada lynxes from a distance. When winter finally settled over the White Mountains, Thomas found himself driving the same stretch of Route 302 where his adventure had first begun. It had been months since he had encountered the mother Canada lynx and her kittens, and now, as the season shifted, he couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed since then. Slowing near the spot where he had first encountered the lynx family, he pulled over and cut the engine. The world around him was still, blanketed by snow, and he simply sat there in silence, watching the snowflakes dance gently from the sky and settle upon the trees. No Canada lynxes appeared, of course. This was a wild landscape, and they were elusive by nature, especially in the winter months. Still, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that they were out there somewhere, hidden among the trees or perched silently in the snow. Hope, Faith, their mother, their siblings, all of them, making their way in a world that was often harsh but occasionally kind. The thought comforted him as he sat there, lost in the quiet beauty of the scene. As he prepared to pull back onto the road, he noticed movement in his rear-view mirror. A New Hampshire fish and game truck had pulled up behind him, and he recognized the figure walking toward his window. It was Jane Martinez, the wildlife officer who had become a friend during the rescue and rehabilitation process. "Knew it had to be you when I saw the cruiser," she said with a grin as Thomas rolled down the window. "Everything okay?" she asked, her eyes studying him. Thomas smiled, feeling a lightness in his chest. "Just taking a moment to remember," he said, his voice soft as he looked back out at the forest. Jane's face lit up at the mention of the Canada lynxes. "Any word on our Canada lynx friends?" she asked. "Funny you should ask," she continued, already eager to share the news. "The research team recorded something pretty remarkable last week. They've got trail cameras all through this area, and one of them captured images of Hope and Faith still together, which is unusual in itself for juvenile Canada lynxes. They were crossing paths with their mother and one of their siblings." Thomas's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Seriously? Did they recognize each other?" he asked, the possibility of this kind of family reunion stirring something deep within him. Jane nodded. "Hard to say for sure, but the footage shows them in the same clearing for nearly 10 minutes, and there was no aggression. That's significant. The researchers are beside themselves. This kind of family interaction isn't well documented in Canada lynxes, especially after such a separation. On a crisp spring morning in New Hampshire, with mist hanging over the ancient pines of the White Mountains, State Trooper Thomas Owens set out for a routine patrol. What began as an ordinary day soon turned into something far more unexpected when he encountered a mother Canada lynx trying to cross Route 302 with her cubs. When the mother abandoned her weakest kitten by the roadside, Owens was faced with a difficult choice: intervene or let nature take its course. His decision not only altered the fate of two vulnerable lynx kittens, but also rekindled a sense of purpose he'd long buried within himself. But this was just the beginning. What Thomas discovered in those woods the following day would set off a series of events that no one could have foreseen. Before we dive in, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you never miss a new story.